Hello, U.S. history students. This is the second section of your 1920s unit, and we're going to look at a focus question regarding the economy and the culture of the 1920s. So before we get there, I just want to show you this chart because it kind of sums up some of the major patterns happening. Blue line, what it indicates is the wealthiest people, what percentage of the economy they controlled over the decade. By the end of it, you've got control of roughly, and since our y-axis here is the second one, it's associated with blue, roughly 35% of the economy is controlled by the top 5% of income earners. So that's really like a couple hundred families control 35% of all the wealth in the country and the income in the country. This red line indicates how much debt. So in 1920, for every dollar of GDP, so that's basically money and income produced, there were 20% of that was held as debt. So for every dollar produced, there's 20 cents owed by every American household. By 1929, that's up towards near a little bit over 35%. So people, this roaring 20s, people roared through the 20s by taking on a bunch of debt to buy stuff that they couldn't necessarily afford, at least compared to previous decades, at least in their views. And the wealthiest became even wealthier, and so it certainly roared for them. So the focus question is, how do the economy and culture of the 1920s lead to changes in American life? Very broad question. You can pretty much answer this with an example from 3 slides, and you'll be good. There's a bunch of different ways. This title is a quote from Calvin Coolidge, and we're going to be looking at him a little bit more later. So the automobile unquestionably is one of the most important elements of the 1920s, and its introduction in a meaningful way to American culture is part of the reason this decade operates the way it is. So at the cheapest, this car right here, which is called the Model T, which is mass-produced by the Ford Motor Company, and Henry Ford, who did not actually invent the automobile, nor mass production, nor the assembly line, but he combined all three into making this car that was relatively affordable for the middle class and lower class workers. In modern dollars, one of these Model Ts in 1927, at their very cheapest, so after I think 17 years of production, it costs roughly $4,000 now. However, even in that year, the Model A Ford was being produced, and this was seen as very old-fashioned. So the scientific management process that Ford used, you saw in the Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, and it was also really prominently used in the slaughterhouses in Chicago. So kind of in almost the opposite of the way a cow is broken down into its parts, the skin is stripped, the meat is chopped up, the cow is killed, etc. The car is kind of built in reverse. So where in an assembly line in a slaughterhouse, the cow is broken down, the car is put together in Henry Ford's innovation. So that's what he really did. He, instead of having assembly lines that disassembled, he was using it with thousands and thousands of parts to build these automobiles. And so every worker had a specialized task. One major change in American culture is this automobile boom made oil a major boom that's even still going on. So about the consequences to climate change. There's also booms in materials used to make cars like steel and rubber. In earlier cars, there's lumber. You can see the wood in the frame right there. But basically anything that's used in an automobile starts to become really valuable. Tragically, I would say, as far as American culture is concerned, urban core stopped developing in a meaningful way. So basically any major downtown, you think Northampton, you think Boston, New York City, downtown Greenfield, Holyoke, whatever it might be, those urban cores, meaning the dense walkable areas of a city, they stop developing because the automobile makes it very easy to not have to live close to where you work or where you shop or where you play. And what we now call suburban sprawl starts as farms and forests, and basically the empty spaces in between cities start to get filled up with car-oriented development, which is something we're going to talk more about in the 50s with the building of the interstate highway system. But you start to get motels, you start to get gas stations, in the thousands. And you think of the, Route 9 in Hadley or off of any exit off any highway, you start to get that kind of development, parking lots around buildings, that kind of thing. Pedestrians die in thousands because of automobiles making the roads dangerous. Sidewalks start to be built in numbers because people who just walk in the street. The car industry creates a crime called jaywalking. It's not really a crime, but to avoid taking responsibility for the deaths caused by cars. And, just going on a car ride becomes part of what people do. And, again, with the environmental and, where people live consequences. This is a good example of sprawl. So this is the city of Los Angeles. This is back in, maybe 1900 or so. Santa Monica and Wilshire Boulevards. Kind of have to tilt your head. Santa Monica is this one. This is Wilshire. You can see back in 1940 or so when this was 5 lanes. I'm sorry, 6 lanes. The modern city, this density has nothing to do with the car. They're not tall because the cars are there. They're tall actually in spite of it. This stuff in between the major urban clusters, that's what cars do as far as development is concerned. Each person here has an automobile and they drive maybe to one of these towers. But under each of these towers, there's a giant parking garage because that's how Los Angeles had to deal with the fact that it's a city oriented around cars. Urban center, urban center, urban center, urban center, strip of urban center, but it's still car oriented because of the time that the city of LA was built. A Market Street for cars, Market Street after cars. Secretary Hoover's, this is 1920. Automobile fatalities over time. And so, yes, I know I showed you guys a chart where the cars themselves get safer for people, but the roads and the streets are more dangerous for pedestrians than they ever were. And so, again, this is a marketing campaign by the auto industry about jaywalking. This is Chicopee. I used to work in this Panera, and this curtain parking lot, it's a curtain around the Walmart and the Home Depot. You can see in the middle, never full, never full. Oops. There's a video attached to it about the cost of parking. So the consumer revolution. What the consumer revolution is basically a major change in how Americans spend money. And so what people start doing, instead of buying stuff that they need, they buy stuff that they want. And these things wear out. So a good example would be these Gillette razors. Finest edge the steel can take, you dispose of them after you're done with them. Piece of steel, what would you do before? The Gillette razor, where you pick it out of a package and put it on your stick or whatever, and then cut your hair off your face or your legs. You sharpen the razor. So instead of sharpening a razor and using it over and over and over again, Americans start to dispose of razors. So you start to get, they're actually in some old houses, they have holes in the wall just to shove the razors into. Where do the razors go? Just in the walls. And so Americans start to become money borrowers and cease to be a nation of savers and start to reuse stuff all the time because they have the option. So the Harding administration's economic policies are basically, in short, laissez-faire economics. He promises a return to normalcy and it ends the social and economic changes of the progressive era. And he basically cuts the federal budget and his, successors in various administrations afterwards from $18 billion in 1918, which is a wartime high, to $3 billion. So what was cut, basically, government inspectors. You got a meat inspector? Well, they don't have a job anymore. It's expensive. So regulation of businesses ceased as much as possible. They try to stop as many union organizing drives as possible. And Harding's cabinet's basically full of a bunch of his poker buddies who make a job of stealing the nation's money, the government's money rather, and that's by extension the American people's money. So this guy, he would talk about, people giving him opinions on things and how it's difficult for him to decide what the true opinion was. It's like, oh, one person says something to me, I think it's the right choice. Another person says it, I think that's the right choice. Most famous scandal in his administration where, Americans lost money because of the Harding administration is the Teapot Dome scandal, which the Secretary of the Interior sold the nation's oil to his oil buddies and pocketed the change. Harding died before his involvement could become proved, and this is Teapot Dome. Kind of see it looks like a teapot, sort of, I guess. In any case, Harding sold the nation, indirectly was responsible for oil that the Navy was owed being sold to corrupt politicians. So his successor, Calvin Coolidge, nicknamed Silent Cal. I've noticed that nothing I never said ever did me any harm. Clever guy. And this is the most important one from him. The business of America is business, and the chief ideal of the American people is idealism. So you may have heard folks talk about economic liberty being something in reference to laissez-faire economics. Freedom, the idea that not having the government tell you what to do is freedom, that's his idealism. Chief business of America is business. Anything that helps out the wealthy will make it so everybody's lives are better. That's the job of the government, is to stay out of the way of business and to promote freedom. Calvin Coolidge wore a suit while fishing. He was a stiff, old-time Yankee, dour former mayor of Northampton, loved business, as I just mentioned a second ago. He who builds a factory builds a temple. He keeps on Andrew Mellon, who is, again, a wealthy banker, continues to lower taxes on corporations of the wealthy. And this is out of belief, if the rich had control of the resources, they're going to benefit the nation through charity and, shared prosperity. Continues crushing labor unions. African Americans ask for an end to the racist Jim Crow terrorism they're frankly dealing with in the South. He does nothing. Mexican migrants who protest against low wages in the Southwest get deported. Keeping out of the way of business leaders who would create a charitable society, he thought, getting wealthy was not a bad thing. And people that got rich, they are going to do what they need to do with their wealth because that's what people just do. Not exactly tied to reality, but again, look, he's wearing a suit while fishing. So the Dawes Plan is the plan that takes place after World War I regarding the money that's owed to the U.S. So, in a sense, what happens is the Germans owe the UK and the French debt because of the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations payments. The UK and France also owe debt to the US because we loaned them money during World War I, and they don't have really much of an economy to pay it back immediately. So the UK and the French need money from Germany to pay the US. What ends up happening is the US, via the Dawes Plan, arranges loans to Germany, and then the Germans pay the UK and the French, the allies up here in the chart, who then pay back the Americans, who then loan the money to the Germans, who give it to the allies. And it's basically the U.S. indirectly just loaning money to itself. And that's what the entire economy of the 1920s is based off of. All well and good, this kind of, you can almost want to call it a sugar high of, economic lending from the U.S. to itself. Again, it keeps the economy great. But if anything ever happens to the U.S. economy, the whole world might find itself in a global depression. Dun, dun, dun. Which is exactly what happens. So the U.S. lends money to itself to keep the global economy afloat and becomes the only thing that matters as far as a global depression is concerned. Just another way of showing you the Dawes Plan. So there's a major divide in culture, partially as a result of these economic changes. So you've got a divide between the folks that are called the modernists and those that are called the fundamentalists. Modernism is kind of easy enough to describe, as well as fundamentalism. People that live the most changed life because of the impacts of industrialization and urbanization and kind of the impact of World War I. People who live in cities are less religious. They believe more in science. They are more in favor of women's rights, for example. They're more religiously diverse. So, it's a changing America that lives in the cities. And people that are okay with this are called modernists because it's where the modern world is. Indirectly in opposition to them, because they're not, anti-modernist specifically, although in practicality they kind of are the fundamentalists. So rural Americans in particular who are Protestant, and believe their way of life is threatened by city dwellers. There's an element where, the use of scientific arguments and as an opposition to the reading, writing, arithmetic curriculum in rural schools makes them feel dismissed. And so this is kind of a siege mentality. And Christian fundamentalists are the group of Protestants who believe you need to reject the multicultural, kind of pluralistic, meaning multi-religion modern world, and embrace the Bible's words as literal truth. This cartoon is called The Descent of the Modernists, and it kind of goes through the steps by which you descend. It's an interesting kind of thing. Here's another card. This is a modernist float in a parade making fun of the fundamentalists. I won't dwell on it, but if we were in class, we can analyze this. And then during the kind of culmination of this conflict in the 1920s between the modernists and the fundamentalists is the Scopes trial, which we've already kind of looked at. So the idea that education and the Darwinian hypothesis of evolution was leaving folks to disbelief in the God of the Bible, children in particular, was seen as deeply threatened in the future. Children are our future. If they learn about a godless world, then they won't become religious, is basically the fear. So the state of Tennessee passes a law banning the teaching of evolution. John Scopes is asked to be a test case, meaning, go get yourself in trouble on purpose, and we'll try to do something about it by the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. And he taught biology in evolution and bio class that he was substitute teaching. The former Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, has him defend the state of Tennessee's law. Clarence Darrow fails to win the trial in his defense of Scopes. Scopes is fined $100. But it kind of embarrasses the fundamentalist movement, and you get a ceasing of new laws like this for a little while. It never really goes away at this conflict, though. And so the culture war that exists in America now is largely on this modernist fundamentalist divide. So in the same time, again, a fear of change kind of plays out in American culture in immigration politics. So groups like the Ku Klux Klan, there are other groups in the U.S. as well, have a fear of non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethnic Americans flooding the country. So even this cartoon kind of shows you this. So the Quota Act in 1925 allows the immigrant groups who were considered assimilatable by groups like the Ku Klux Klan into the country at a higher rate than other groups like Catholics and Jews and Orthodox Christians. Asians are banned entirely. But ironically, I guess not ironically, but as far as modern politics are concerned, a little strangely, Mexicans are still allowed to enter the U.S. as migrant labor in unlimited numbers. So what this quota system does is it limits the diversity of immigration to the U.S. and ensures it's going to maintain a white Protestant majority for longer. So the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan impacts the 20s partially through their support of anti-immigrant policies like the Quota Act, but also just through terrorizing African Americans and attempting to destroy their political power and that of immigrants. The Klan loses some national power after the Quota Act is passed because they lose much of the reason for it being popular. But they also are deeply corrupt, and they take over basically the state government of Tennessee. Their leader then attempts to murder a woman and bites off her ear, and they kind of lose some credibility. So they impact the 20s by terrifying people, effectively. Prohibition passes again because of the conflict between modernists and fundamentalists. And so there's also an additional element where kind of liberal, progressive types are in this unlikely alliance with the fundamentalists. So forever in American history, since the founding, there's these ideas of moderation and temperance held by all Christian groups, not just fundamentalists. Many immigrant groups are seen as by nativists, racists, against anyone who isn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, as being drunk as an ethnic characteristic. And then progressive groups think that alcohol is responsible for social ills and want its removal as a part of a scientific reform. The 18th Amendment bans the production and transportation of alcohol, but bootleggers allow for binges of demand to be filled. And what a bootlegger is a smuggler of alcohol, mostly get it from Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean. Organized crime develops for the first time, and Al Capone and mobsters like him become entrenched because now there's an illegal market to try to gain control over. This is just kind of a diagram of where some of the booze came from in New England. Al Capone, the mobsters, machine guns, murder on the streets. Capone got arrested for tax evasion, not for smuggling alcohol. And finally, Prohibition gets repealed. This is in 1933, when the 18th Amendment is repealed by the 21st. So last but not least, there's Marcus Garvey, who is a reactant, in a sense, to the economy and culture of the 1920s by being an immigrant who sees how the United States is treating immigrants, and African Americans in particular. So Garvey, he sees the work of the Klan. He sees the marches in D.C. He, again, is a black man from the Caribbean. He's from Jamaica. He comes to the United States. And he founds this Universal Negro Improvement Association that basically says, hey, the U.S. is too racist for black people to live in and be treated like the dignified human beings that they are. Yeah, phrases like "black is beautiful" and um, you know, black. The idea of black power, for example, which comes out in the '60s, has its roots in many ways in the work of Marcus Garvey. Um, so eventually, Marcus Garvey is deported from the United States for mail fraud, but his ideas, which he called actually black nationalism or black separatism, influenced later groups like the Nation of Islam. They also influenced the civil rights movement by advocating for the dignity, and in some cases, he says black people are, better than white people. He's got this real, I guess, open patriotism is the right word, but it's a real advocacy for African Americans and black folks in the world just in general. So he's proud. You can see the guy's wearing a uniform. Um, he's got a complicated legacy. The mail fraud was probably true, but nonetheless, he has a huge impact on the civil rights movement and the African American, movement towards pride in culture in a lot of ways.